To understand John Mulligan, you have to understand what drag racing looked like in the mid-1960s and why somebody with options would choose to climb inside one of those cars at all. And I mean that genuinely, because these things were extraordinary machines in every sense of the word, including the terrifying ones. Top Fuel in the mid-60s was raw. There were no computer systems, no data logging, no standardized safety certifications. The cars were front-engine Slingshot dragsters, which meant the driver sat directly behind a supercharged Chrysler Hemi that was running on nitromethane and making somewhere north of 1,500 horsepower. Everything that could kill you, the engine, the supercharger, the clutch assembly, the drive shaft, the transmission, all of it sat between the driver and the finish line. The driver sat behind the bomb, not in front of it. Fire suits existed, but they were early generation stuff. Nomex had only recently become commercially available. Bill Simpson had introduced his heat shield fire suit in 1967 after a conversation with a NASA astronaut about what it felt like to wear an aluminized suit. The NHRA wouldn't adopt formal thermal protection standards requiring suits to withstand serious temperatures for a full 10 seconds until 1970. Onboard fire suppression systems were not standard equipment. The starting line paramedics and safety crews were doing the best they could with what they had. This was just the world. And the cars were getting faster at a rate that the safety infrastructure could not match. Every week, somebody was pushing the envelope a little further, and the equipment was not always keeping up. The result was that the late 1960s became drag racing's deadliest era. Mike Sorokin was killed by a clutch explosion in December 1967. There were others. The racers knew the risks. They showed up anyway, because these were men and women who had built their entire identities around speed, and the only way to be around it was to be inside it. John Mulligan was absolutely one of those people. He grew up in Orange County, California, and from everything his friends and competitors later described about him, the racing obsession was lifelong and total. Tom McEwen, who you know as the Mongoose, delivered the eulogy at Mulligan's funeral, and even in that devastating context, he found a way to describe the purity of what drove the man. From those years after his birth in Hermosa Beach, John's attention was focused on someday fulfilling the dream of piloting a car across the racetracks of this country. As he grew to maturity through his years at Westminster High School, he never wavered in this goal and ambition. That's McEwen talking about his friend at the graveside. That kind of simple clarity about what drove somebody is pretty rare. Mulligan came up through the gasser ranks first, which was the standard path at the time. His first race car was a 1933-34 Willys Coupe, and he learned the craft from the ground up. By 1964, he was driving dragsters for the Ward and Ware team, running their cars called the Long Shot and the Big Shot, which are great names. He then ran for Adams, Ware, and Mulligan, where his engine builder was a guy named Gene Adams, who became one of the more important voices in preserving the Mulligan story for posterity. Adams remembered Mulligan's relationship with speed with real clarity. He had a real desire to drive a fast car. He loved it. He liked to win, naturally, but he wasn't as thrilled about winning the race as he was about getting low elapsed time and top speed. If he won the race, but somebody else was outrunning him, that kind of irritated him. That detail is important because it tells you exactly who John Mulligan was as a competitor. He wasn't chasing trophies, he was chasing the number. He wanted the fastest car on the property, and if somebody else had a faster car, regardless of who won the round, that was the thing that ate at him. That mindset drove him to push harder than almost anyone else on the circuit. Adams also remembered the sheer physicality of what Mulligan was doing every time he got behind the wheel. Just think about driving one of those things at night, with fire coming out of the headers, tire smoke in your face, and you're sitting behind the supercharger trying to look through the fire and smoke and flames without traction. He wasn't afraid of anything. If things weren't going all that great, he still wanted to drive the car. The partnership that would define Mulligan's career came together in the mid-60s when he started working with Tim Beebe and his brother Dave. The Beebe family had been in drag racing for years, and Dave Beebe had been the driver on their Top Fuel car. But Dave was a family man who preferred to race close to home in Southern California. When Tim decided he wanted to tour nationally with the car, Dave stepped aside, and John Mulligan got the seat. It was one of those decisions that seemed simple at the time and turned out to matter enormously. The team set up shop in Garden Grove, California, and Tim Beebe proved to be a seriously gifted engine tuner. Jerry Ruth, who ran his own cars out of that same Garden Grove shop, described Mulligan's talent on the starting line this way. He had developed a rhythm with his right foot and the countdown of the old 5-bulb 5/10ths tree. He would blip the throttle every time a yellow came on, and he could catch the green light with the RPM up. He was the only one I ever saw who could do that. That starting line ability, combined with the car Tim Beebe was putting together, was already a dangerous combination. The car itself had an identity from the jump. It was painted in two-tone green with the words "Fighting Irish" on the body and a shamrock. This was a direct nod to Mulligan's Irish heritage, and it was also a deliberate act of defiance against one of racing's oldest superstitions, which held that green was bad luck on a race car. Mulligan wasn't buying it. He was Irish, it was his car, and it was going to be green. The irony of that choice, given how the story ends, is something I'll leave you to sit with. The other piece of the team's identity was the nickname. You know how Don Prudhomme was the snake and Tom McEwen was the mongoose? Well, John Mulligan looked at that situation and figured whoever runs those two must be the zookeeper. So that became his nickname, and it stuck. Prudhomme later recalled it with a laugh. Of course, John Mulligan tried to top us both by becoming the zookeeper. I thought that was pretty funny. That's a pretty good read on who Mulligan was as a person. Quick wit, good sense of humor, and completely unbothered by the established hierarchy of the sport. Carl Olson, who was one of the top fuel circuit's respected veterans, described him simply and directly. He stood out from the crowd in two ways. One was that his cars were consistent winners, and the other was that he was a bitchin' guy. He had a great sense of humor and was a practical joker. He personified the era in terms of a carefree lifestyle. He was a very approachable guy with a marvelous personality. Jim Nickel, who was a fellow racer, remembered a story about touring with Mulligan on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, where John was lobbing M80 firecrackers out the truck window at Mad Dog Cook's vehicle in the next lane over. That's the kind of detail that tells you exactly what it felt like to be around somebody. By late 1966, Beebe and Mulligan were already posting elite numbers. Mulligan ran a national record of 6.95 elapsed time at 221 miles per hour at Carlsbad Raceway, which, for context, was among the quickest passes in the country. By the end of that year, 6 of the 20 quickest elapsed times nationally and 3 of the 19 fastest speeds were his. This wasn't a promising newcomer anymore. This was a legitimate contender. The 1967 and 1968 seasons built the case further. The first Fighting Irish chassis had been a homemade unit, originally built by Sam Vincent, then lengthened by Frank Hussar at Race Car Specialties, with a full Tom Hanna body on it. George Cerny Jr. laid down the green paint and Fighting Irish lettering. The engine at this stage was a 392 Chrysler with cast iron heads running on nitromethane. In 1968, they went to the NHRA Spring Nationals at Englishtown, New Jersey, and finished runner-up to Don Garlitz. During that event, Mulligan ran 232.55 miles per hour, which was a pass that hadn't been backed up yet, so it wasn't an official record, but it showed what the car was capable of. Then, in October of 1968, the team debuted a brand new chassis at the NHRA World Finals in Tulsa. This one was built by Woody Gilmore at Race Car Engineering. Gilmore offered to build it at a discount so he could use the team's success as advertising, which tells you something about where Beebe and Mulligan's reputation stood in the industry. The new car posted top speed at Tulsa, and Mulligan drove it to the final round, where he finished runner-up to Benny Osborne. Runner-up at the World Finals, 1 round from being world champion. That's 6 major national event runner-up finishes across 2 years. 6 times Mulligan and Beebe went deep into a tournament and came home with the second-place trophy. Any one of those could have gone the other way. The team was right there.
But 1969 started with something different. It started with a win. The NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona in February 1969 is one of the most prestigious events on the calendar, and it has been since the beginning. It draws the best cars in the country, and it gets covered by every major publication. When Beebe and Mulligan arrived there in 1969, they had everything to prove and the fastest car on the property. Mulligan ran 6.93 in the semifinals, and then he drew Don Prudhomme in the final. The Snake was the benchmark in top fuel at this point in his career, and running against him in a final was about as stiff a test as you could get. Prudhomme's engine broke. Mulligan clocked a 6.95 and crossed the stripe first. After 6 runner-up finishes, the Fighting Irish was finally in the winner's circle at a national event. The NHRA's own retrospective on that day later put it simply. Probably the best thing that happened at the 1969 Winter Nationals is that John Mulligan won top fuel with the Fighting Irish car. What happened next in the spring of 1969 took the car to another level entirely. The team sourced a 426 Chrysler Hemi from the Ram Chargers, which, for those who don't know that name, was one of the most legendary engine-building operations in the sport's history. The deal was brokered by Marv Rifchin of M&H Tires. The result of dropping that engine into Beebe's chassis was immediate and dramatic. As Dave West, who later did extensive research on this story through Tim Beebe himself, noted, they ran faster and quicker than the Ram Chargers the first weekend with the new engine. Top speed climbed to 233.76 miles per hour. The car was hitting numbers that the rest of the field couldn't touch. It was a full team at the top of its game heading into the biggest event of the year. The 1969 NHRA U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park was everything the name implies. This was drag racing Super Bowl. The best cars and the best drivers from every corner of the country descended on Indy on Labor Day weekend, and what happened on those starting lights defined the season. And then John Mulligan went out and put down a qualifying run that nobody in the history of the sport had ever come close to matching. 6.43 seconds elapsed time. Let me put that in context for you. The existing national record coming into that event was 6.68. Mulligan didn't just break it. He didn't edge it out by a few hundredths. He shattered it by more than 0.2 of a second, which in a sport measured in thousandths is an incomprehensible margin. It was as if someone had run a sub-3.5-minute mile at a local track meet. The racing community stood there and tried to absorb what they had just seen. There was already speculation the car could go into the high 6.30s. But Tim Beebe noticed something during that qualifying pass. The tires had shaken. Nothing catastrophic, just a brief instability off the launch that the team had not experienced before. Beebe traced it to his clutch tuning. He had been progressively slipping the clutch to get more speed out of the car, and it was now right at the edge of what the launch characteristics could absorb. It was a warning. The fastest pass in history came with a vibration that Beebe filed away and thought about. There's one other detail about that qualifying run worth understanding. Tim Beebe had made a decision before the event to run the car without its nose and body panels, not because of weight reduction, because of a labor dispute. NHRA was paying appearance money to Don Garlits and Don Prudhomme for showing up to major events. Beebe and Mulligan, who had just run the quickest elapsed time in the sport's history, were getting nothing. So Beebe stripped the body off the car and ran it naked. It was his way of making a point. You want to see what we've got? Then you pay us like you pay the others. As Susie Beebe later confirmed, Tim decided not to run the nose on the car since NHRA wouldn't pay any appearance money, and he knew that both Garlits and Prudhomme were getting paid. I guess it was his way of boycotting NHRA. So the quickest car in the world was sitting in the Indy pits naked as a protest, and nobody who was writing checks seemed to notice or care.
Eliminations began on Labor Day, September 1st, 1969. Top Fuel eliminations were the marquee event of the Nationals, and the pits were packed with the kind of crowd that only the U.S. Nationals could pull. ABC's Wide World of Sports was there covering the event, which at that time was not a given. Wally Parks, who founded the NHRA, had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to keep drag racing crashes off television and out of newspapers because he understood that the sport's image was fragile and one bad image could set everything back. ABC was there because drag racing had arrived as legitimate national entertainment. In the first round of Top Fuel eliminations, John Mulligan drew Tommy Ivo. Ivo was a legitimate Top Fuel threat who had been racing since the 50s and had earned his reputation the hard way. This was going to be a real race. What happened in the seconds after the lights dropped has been reconstructed through multiple eyewitness accounts and the technical analysis Tim Beebe did afterward. Here's the chain of events. Mulligan launched hard, and immediately the run looked even more aggressive than the 6.43 qualifying pass. The car was on a trajectory to set another record. And then the tire shook, harder this time. The vibration that had whispered during qualifying was now screaming. The tire shake transferred violent oscillation through the entire driveline, and this is where the car's one critical design vulnerability became fatal. Instead of using what was called a Greek driveline coupler at the rear end, which was the standard equipment and was specifically designed to flex and absorb driveline vibration, Beebe and Mulligan's car was using a conventional U-joint, with the needle-bearing cross removed, bolted rigidly to the rear end by 4 quarter-inch bolts. 4 small bolts with no give, no flex, no ability to absorb what was coming through the line. The vibration hit those bolts, and they let go.
The coupler came apart. The fractured driveline took out the clutch assembly. One of the clutch discs cut through the aluminum oil pan, tearing a hole roughly 2 inches by 1 inch. Hot oil sprayed onto the exhaust headers, running at temperature, and the car became a torch. The fireball was enormous. Mulligan was engulfed. And somewhere in those next few moments, something happened that Tom McEwen would later describe at the funeral in a way that has never left the people who were there. To the final moments, John thought of the other guy first, as he remained cool enough to guide his flaming car into a rail to protect the spectators and fellow drivers. By all accounts, the wreckage still crossed the finish line ahead of Tommy Ivo. A photographer named Ken, who was shooting from the side of the track about 300 feet past the start line, was looking through his viewfinder when it happened. By the time I got it focused, John was at the finish. I managed to rewind and get a couple more shots. When he got his slides developed, he said he viewed the crash several times. Then, when he found out Mulligan had died 17 days later, he pulled those 3 slides out and never looked at them again. Another eyewitness at the same location wrote about it 40 years later. I was there also, same side, about 300 feet out from the starting line. From there, it didn't look like much fire. I just remember a lot of smoke. Went to the pits after first round, and the reports were all bad. A spectator who was there and ended up in a drag racing forum decades later put it simply. Sadly, I was at the Nationals in 1969 when John Mulligan had his car explode. All I really remember is the fireball. It put a real damper on the races.
Mulligan was transported to an Indianapolis hospital with severe burns. The early reports were cautiously hopeful. He was reportedly conscious, sitting up and talking in the early days. The people who knew him held on to that. He had survived the crash. He was fighting. But the damage to his body from what fire does to human tissue when it burns like that is something that early 1969 medicine was not equipped to overcome. The burns to his lungs were severe. The infection set in. His kidneys began to fail. 17 days after the crash, on approximately September 17, 1969, John Mulligan died. He was 26 years old. Susie Beebe, who was Tim's wife and watched all of it play out, said this: "Johnny lived for 17 days and was in terrible pain most of the time." The Indianapolis News ran the headline, "Drag Racer Mulligan, 26, dies," on September 18th. The Los Angeles Times followed the next day, "Services set for Dragster." The services were held in Southern California, and Tom McEwen delivered the eulogy for his friend. The full text of what McEwen said has been preserved, and it is worth reading in full if you ever want to understand what this community felt about John Mulligan. But one passage gets cited more than any other. "Records will be set again, the crowds will thrill to others, and the trophies will soon gather the patina of age. John Mulligan left things more lasting than records and trophies. He left something more important to all. He achieved something much greater. He gave his family a pride unsurpassed by that given any family by their son and brother." McEwen was the mongoose. He was Mulligan's contemporary and his friend, and he stood up at that service and tried to find words for something that didn't really have them. By all accounts, he did it well. Now, here's what I want you to understand about September 1969 in drag racing, because this is not a single story in isolation. This is a moment that arrived at the end of a very bloody period in the sport's history, and what happened after it changed everything. The late 1960s Top Fuel community had been watching its best people die one after another, and the sport's response had been largely reactive. Mike Sorokin killed by a clutch explosion in December 1967. There were others in this era. The front-engine Slingshot was a design that placed the driver in the worst possible position relative to the components most likely to fail catastrophically, and the safety equipment was nowhere close to the power levels these cars were generating. There had been talk about rear-engine configurations for years. The physics were obvious. Put the engine behind the driver, and all of the most dangerous hardware is no longer aimed directly at the person trying to survive. But the Slingshot was established, and the conventional wisdom was that the weight distribution worked, and the rear-engine idea was either not practical or not fast enough to justify the transition. Inertia kept the status quo going, even as drivers kept dying. Mulligan's death broke something open. Woody Gilmore had built the Fighting Irish car that was destroyed at Indy. Gilmore was a respected chassis builder, and he was also John Mulligan's friend.
The NHRA itself later documented what happened next in Gilmore's thinking. Spurred by the death of Mulligan, a good friend and longtime customer, Gilmore and hired hand Pat Foster finally put together a rear-engine car that debuted in December of 1969. That car was not the one that changed history, but it was part of the movement that was now accelerating. In March of 1960, Don Garlitz was at Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach for an event. During a run, the transmission in his front-engine Slingshot exploded. The blast took the front of the car completely off. Garlitz lost half his right foot. The racer who would go on to win more Top Fuel championships than anyone in history sat in what remained of his car and made a decision right there on the track. He was done sitting on a bomb. By the 1971 Winter Nationals, Garlitz debuted Swamp Rat 14, the rear-engine top fueler that went on to win the event and render the front-engine Slingshot obsolete within 2 years. And in September of 1960, Jim Nickel had his car sawed in half by a clutch explosion at the U.S. Nationals. That was the last major piece of evidence the sport needed that the Slingshot era had to end. The rear-engine revolution saved an incalculable number of lives over the next 50 years. The drivers who came after 1960 were sitting behind the engine, not in front of it. When something failed catastrophically, it was the car that absorbed it, not the driver's body. You can draw a direct line from the deaths of Mulligan and Sorokin and the near death of Garlitz to the modern top fuel car that looks nothing like the Slingshots of the 60s. But there was also a more immediate and specific change that came directly from what happened to Mulligan at Indy. The failure mode that killed him, the clutch disc cutting through the oil pan and spraying oil onto a hot engine, led directly to a mandate for steel liners in clutch containment shields. Before this change, the shields were aluminum. Aluminum is light, but when a clutch disc comes apart at speed, a spinning piece of metal shrapnel will punch right through aluminum like it's cardboard. Steel stops it. After Mulligan's death, the NHRA mandated that clutch cans had to be steel-lined, specifically to prevent what happened on September 1, 1969, from happening again. As one forum member who came of age in this era put it decades later, every time I see a safety part on a race car, I always tell people it is only on there because someone died and gave their life for that part. Thanks, John.
The legacy didn't end with safety rules. The community that had known and loved John Mulligan carried him forward in other ways, too. Tim Beebe went back to work. In 1970, he and Dave created the Beebe Brothers Funny Car team at Orange County Raceway and set a new NHRA elapsed time record. In 1971, he built the Fighting Irish Funny Car with Dick Roseberg driving. In 1973, he returned to Top Fuel with Jim Murphy. CarCraft magazine named him their Top Fuel Crew Chief of the Year in both 1969 and 1970. He eventually became an NHRA Hall of Famer. Tim Beebe died in 2022 in Porterville, California. The burned hulk of the car that came back from Indianapolis was scavenged for parts. The engine went into Tom McEwen's funny car. The burned back half of the chassis sat at Tom Hanna's shop for almost a year before being cut up and scrapped. The only original piece that survived, as far as anyone knows, is the front 6 to 8 inches of the nose, which had been stored in the trailer during the Nationals since Beebe had run the car stripped. It ended up with one of Hanna's employees. A man named Dave West became the most dedicated historian of the Beebe and Mulligan story. He built a full working replica of the 1969 Winter Nationals winning Fighting Irish Fueler, researching every detail through Tim Beebe himself before Beebe's death. That replica car has appeared at the Bakersfield March Meat Cacklefest and other nostalgia events. Hot Wheels produced a die-cast model of the Beebe and Mulligan Dragster in 2009. Drag racing artist David Carl Peters created limited edition prints. The T-shirts that say Beebe and Mulligan, World's Fastest, are still out there at events, worn by people who were there and people who weren't, but who know the story. In 2019, at the 50-year retrospective on the 1969 Winter Nationals, the NHRA's coverage specifically called out the moment John Mulligan won. Probably the best thing that happened at the 1969 Winter Nationals is that John Mulligan won Top Fuel with the Fighting Irish car. And then there is the matter of the 6.43. The legacy didn't end with safety rules. The community that had known and loved John Mulligan carried him forward in other ways, too. Tim Beebe went back to work. In 1970, he and Dave created the Beebe Brothers Funny Car team at Orange County Raceway and set a new NHRA elapsed time record. In 1971, he built the Fighting Irish Funny Car with Dick Roseberg driving. In 1973, he returned to Top Fuel with Jim Murphy. Carcraft magazine named him their Top Fuel Crew Chief of the Year in both 1969 and 1970. He eventually became an NHRA Hall of Famer. Tim Beebe died in 2022 in Porterville, California. The burned hulk of the car that came back from Indianapolis was scavenged for parts. The engine went into Tom McEwen's funny car. The burned back half of the chassis sat at Tom Hanna's shop for almost a year before being cut up and scrapped. The only original piece that survived, as far as anyone knows, is the front 6 to 8 inches of the nose, which had been stored in the trailer during the Nationals since Beebe had run the car stripped. It ended up with one of Hanna's employees. A man named Dave West became the most dedicated historian of the Beebe and Mulligan story. He built a full working replica of the 1969 Winter Nationals winning Fighting Irish Fueler, researching every detail through Tim Beebe himself before Beebe's death. That replica car has appeared at the Bakersfield March Meet Cacklefest and other nostalgia events. Hot Wheels produced a die-cast model of the Beebe and Mulligan Dragster in 2009. Drag racing artist David Carl Peters created limited edition prints. The T-shirts that say Beebe and Mulligan, World's Fastest, are still out there at events, worn by people who were there and people who weren't, but who know the story. In 2019, at the 50-year retrospective on the 1969 Winter Nationals, the NHRA's coverage specifically called out the moment John Mulligan won. Probably the best thing that happened at the 1969 Winter Nationals is that John Mulligan won Top Fuel with the Fighting Irish car. And then there is the matter of the 6.43. That run at Indy sat as the quickest elapsed time in Top Fuel history for nearly a year. In a sport where records fall every month, holding the top spot for that long in that era is extraordinary. It was the record that existed at the time of his death. The quickest pass anyone had ever made in a Top Fuel dragster, and the last competitive run John Mulligan ever made. NHRA ranked him 41st on their all-time list of the 50 greatest drivers in the sport's history. When they expanded that to the top 75 in 2026, he was still on it. That ranking is based on what he accomplished on the track in a career that lasted less than 5 years at the national level. A guy who competed from 1964 to 1969 and is still being recognized more than 50 years later among the greatest who ever did it. One thing Dave West wrote in his exhaustive research into the story has stayed with me. Although I never had the pleasure of meeting John Mulligan, I know that he was the genuine article, and I've never heard a negative thing said about him. I think that is one of the reasons they were such a popular team. I've looked at every source I could find on John Mulligan, and I can't find a single person who had anything bad to say about him. Not a rival, not a crew member, not an official. The impression that comes through everything written or said about him is consistent. Good guy, ferocious competitor, loved by his community, gone too soon. Susie Beebe, who watched this story from the inside, said something about the wide world of sports broadcasts that aired months after the crash on ABC. The network showed the footage of the accident, which was almost unprecedented for an NHRA event, given Wally Park's long-standing policy against that kind of coverage. Many fans who had heard Mulligan was in a serious crash but didn't know he had died found out about his death by watching the telecast. Susie wrote that she had always been thankful she never watched the telecast. One of those fans was a young guy who ended up on a drag racing forum years later. He wrote this: "John was my hero. I remember seeing the footage of the accident on the wide world of sports. Back then, it was November before they would show the Nationals. I knew John had been in a wreck, but did not know he had died until the telecast. Cried like a baby for hours." So here is what actually happened at Indianapolis Raceway Park on Labor Day 1969, stripped down to its simplest terms. A 26-year-old kid from Hermosa Beach, California, who had been chasing speed his entire life, went out on a Labor Day afternoon and made the quickest run in Top Fuel history.
And then, because of 4 quarter-inch bolts that couldn't absorb what his own record-breaking car was throwing at them, his car became a fire, and 17 days later, he was gone. The sport that killed him was not the same sport after his death. The safety rules changed, the car design changed, the culture around driver protection changed. Every top fuel driver who has climbed into a rear-engine car since 1971 is driving a safer machine, in part because John Mulligan drove an unsafe one. Every Nitro racer who has ever been pulled from a burning car by a safety crew using equipment rated for the job is alive in some small way because of what happened to John Mulligan and Mike Sorokin and the others who didn't make it out of the Slingshot era. The guy who held 38 national track records when he died. The guy who ran 6.43 at Indy. The zookeeper. The son and brother whose family was given a pride unsurpassed by what any family could receive from their own. He deserved more years. The record is clear on that. But the record is equally clear that the years he had were spent doing exactly what he was put on this earth to do, and doing it better than almost anyone ever has. And the work he left behind, in the form of changed rules and safer cars, and the memory of what it looked like when someone truly loved what they were doing, that work is still out there. It's still running.